Okay, so I just want to make clear where I went a little too fast here. The first premise is not that we will never reach the post-human stage, as I wrote, but rather that the fraction of human-level civilizations that reach a post-human stage is very close to zero. So, human level civs rarely reach post-human state. Okay. So why is this point important? Let me go through the argument again with my clarification. So, if it's true that human-level civilizations rarely reach, and I mean very, very rarely, close to zero, reach the post-human level, then it's the case that in the history of the universe, barely any, or perhaps even zero, post-human civilizations exist. Right? So that's the point. So if zero post-human civilizations exist, then of course we are very unlikely to be in a simulation ourselves. Because to be in a simulation, we require a post-human civilization. But if there are none, then probably we're the only one. Then probably we're physical beings. However, another conclusion from this, if this were true, is that we are very unlikely to reach the post-human level. Because if it's true that human-level civs rarely reach post-human level, then it's also true that it's very unlikely that we will reach post-human level. And it could be for any kind of reason. I mean, civilizations rise and fall. Perhaps our civilization that has risen so spectacularly will fall very, very spectacularly, and our species will be stuck in the Middle Ages for a few thousand years and then go extinct. You know, this might happen. We've talked a lot about a lot of different extinction scenarios. Any one of these might be true of most civilizations. The second one here is that it's not only that post-humans don't like simulations, but that the number of simulations created by post-humans is vanishingly small. So if we imagine that in the physical world there might be many, many post-humans, we have to think that almost none of these post-humans create simulations. Perhaps they don't allow it in their society, and they have very strict regulations for this and very strict surveillance. Perhaps all the post-humans are very similar in mind, and that they are very similar and none of them are interesting. Perhaps they have some kind of mental ability that allows them to imagine things very vividly, and therefore they don't need the simulation to do simulations. And I think that among these three possibilities, perhaps two is the least likely. Because if one is false, then we should expect that there are perhaps many post-human civilizations, right? Or at least that there are many people in these post-human civilizations. And if there are a lot of people it seems strange to me that no one would think of the idea of making a simulation of a world like ours. But I don't know. I mean, this is just speculation, of course. But I mean, we can't disregard this probability, but I think it's slightly lower perhaps than the other ones. And the third one is, of course, that we are in a simulation. And being in a simulation is perhaps barely, I mean, perhaps mostly interesting from a philosophical point of view. But it also could also be interesting from a technical point of view. Because if we are in fact living in a simulation, then it means that we should be able to make simulations of our own. Some of you are working with computers or will be working in branches of technology where simulations could be crucial, right? We are making a lot of different simulations nowadays. I read that Boeing, the new Boeing Dreamliner only needed 3 tests in a wind tunnel, compared with the last Boeing that was constructed that needed 27 tests in a wind tunnel, and the rest was done by simulations. And of course, this cuts a lot of costs. But what if we could simulate the economic development of a country? What if we could simulate the spread of a disease? What if we could simulate the pressure in the social pressure in a country during some kind of revolutionary period? A lot of advantages could be granted from simulations, but of course, all these social simulations require that we have this ability to create very fine-grained simulations that are similar to our own reality. And today, of course, this is impossible, but perhaps not in the near future. So the mere thought that we might be living in a simulation opens up a realm of possibilities, but also poses some ethical questions. Like, if we are living in a simulation, at what point is it immoral to create a simulation and then shut it down? Obviously, the simulations that are created to test the weather are not conscious, so we don't need to care about that. But let's imagine that you make a simulation with programs that are independent agents. So these kinds of simulations are possible today. They are not very advanced. I think we can safely say that they are not conscious. At some point, however, when the sophistication reaches a certain point, we might start wondering, are these programs conscious? Do they have thoughts of their own and feelings of their own? And what does that imply for us as creators? So that's one issue that is worth considering. It's also worth considering the God interpretation of these post-human simulators. The difference between the simulators and God, of course, is that simulators are not good. They're not nice in any sense that we recognize as nice, or at least not necessarily so. And that could explain why the world contains a lot of suffering. Perhaps the simulators did not wish to create a good universe, but an interesting universe. And interesting universes require challenges and perhaps some degree of suffering. We might also consider the possibility that only some of us have simulated minds of our own. It's much easier to simulate an object in the world if that object has no consciousness, we can assume, right? So you know, each one of you, that you are conscious, right? You have conscious experiences. An apple tastes like an apple, right? You have feelings and subjective experiences of the world. So every one of you knows that they are, if they are simulated, then they're certainly simulated in a way that allows for consciousness. But of course, we don't know if others are similarly simulated. Considering that it requires much less computer power to simulate worlds which have zombie people, so to speak. I mean, people who just act in different ways and don't have any subjective experiences. Or it's much easier to simulate a world where only the room where you are at the moment actually exists. Then perhaps we should draw the conclusion that by the same indifference principle, that we are living in just such a world. Let me repeat that argument. Assume that we are in fact in a simulation. What kind of simulation is it more likely that we are in? Is it a simulation with many, many people, which requires a lot of computing power? Or are we in a simulation with only a handful of people and a handful of simulated places? Well, since the smaller simulations are more likely to be more abundant, perhaps we should assume that we are the only ones that are being simulated. And that in fact, the corridor out here does not exist until we open the door and go out there. This is the only room that exists. And perhaps I cease to exist when you go back home and so forth. But of course, I mean, I know that I exist. So if it's someone that should cease to exist, it should be you. But of course, maybe I'm just saying this as part of the simulation. This view is called Solipsism. And it's a version of the idealistic view. So Solipsism states that the only person who exists in reality is yourself. And well, many philosophers think that this is kind of silly. We don't have any reason to believe that you are the only one who exists. So why should we assume something that is implausible when we have no reason to assume it? So it's not a very popular view. But if we assume that we're living in a simulation, then we have new reasons to think about solipsism. But I think that the main implications of the simulation hypothesis are not that big. It's not like the world doesn't really exist. I mean, it exists for us. And this is the only thing we need to assume is that the world is real for us. One possible consequence, of course, is that one of the existential risks we talked about is a simulation shutdown. Right? The simulators grow tired of us and just shut it down. But I don't see really what we can do to avoid it. So it's not a risk that is worth considering unless we have a plan how to avoid it. So basically, I think the conclusion should be that if we're living in a simulation, that's kind of cool, but it won't change that much. Okay, any questions? Okay, So I think we'll round up here, and next time we'll talk about the singularity.